Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Leona Shaw. I am with Métis Nation British Columbia, and I'm the Senior Director for Environmental Protection, Agriculture, and Food Sovereignty.
Good morning. My name is Jen Pellepew. I'm the Engagement and Policy Manager with the Métis Nation of Alberta. For work, that's what I do. For life, my family is Ukrainian and Métis. My mom's side is Scottish and Métis. My family names are Pelletier and Norris. And my dad's family, straight from the Ukraine, he was the first child in his family to be born outside of the Ukraine.
Hello. Is this mic on?
Yep.
Okay. My name is Cole Kirchen. I'm actually going to speak a little bit in Michif. This is the language of the Métis people, so I'm just going to introduce myself that way. So, Tonche, Cole Kirchen, Tishnikashon, Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan, Oceania. So I just said, hello, my name is Cole Kirchen. I'm from Meadow Lake, Saskatchewan. That's my hometown where I was born. My relations, I trace back on my grandmother's side to Chief Mistawasis, Pierre Boulanger. He was a Métis man who became the chief of a Cree tribe. So that's my ancestor. And yeah, that's my Métis heritage. I'm a policy analyst at Métis Nation Saskatchewan. I work in the Ministry of Lands and Environment, and I'm very, very happy to be here today. So it's good to see everyone out.
Perfect. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jordan Plain. I am a descendant of Malkadet Jisom of Penetangwisheen. My family has a long history in Penetang and along the Great Lakes. Originally starting in Drummond Island, which my community and my family were removed from their lands and eventually settled in what is now known as Penetangwisheen. I am the president of the Métis Nation of Ontario Youth Council and the youth representative on the Provisional Council of the Métis Nation of Ontario. I think that's it.
Okay, hi everyone, good morning. My name is Kate Gillis. I'm the Policy Advisor of International Relations at the Métis National Council. I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Calgary. I was born and raised in Calgary, Alberta. I'm located in Ottawa now. My mom is a Chartrand. Our family roots back to St. Laurent, Manitoba, and I'm really happy to be here today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all very much. I'm sure you'll notice that everyone on our panel has introduced themselves, where they're from, and their family names, and that is something that I've kind of forgotten to do, and it's a very integral part of Métis culture. So if I were to introduce myself correctly, I'd say my name is Dane D'Souza. I was born and raised on Treaty 7 territory, Mohkinstsis, Calgary, Alberta, Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, and my family names are Sutherland and Sinclair from the Red River Valley area of what is now Manitoba. So, in speaking to introducing who the Métis Nation are, I'd like to kind of just give a brief history to our audience for those of you who may not be familiar with the history of the Métis. The Métis are a distinct Indigenous identity, distinct Indigenous peoples originating from what is now the Red River Valley area of Manitoba, Canada. And we are descendants of European settlers, fur trappers and traders that intermarried into Cree, Ojibwe, and Anishinaabe families and developed an identity and a culture that walks in two worlds. And it honors both cultures and identities as one individual expression of humanity. We honor our Cree and Anishinaabe and Ojibwe teachings that we've learned from our ancestors, right alongside those European teachings on spirituality, thought, and identity around our kitchen tables and our lives and how we live. We're fur traders, we're trappers, we're farmers, and that's just speaking historically. Now we're a people who really walk in two worlds as being urban and rural. We're spread all throughout the Métis homeland, which extends from Ontario to British Columbia. And throughout all these areas, as Métis people, we've maintained our connection to the lands where we reside and our kin in that area. Really, if you had to ask what being Métis is, it's not only walking in two worlds, but it's maintaining an identity, a culture, a spirituality, and a relationship with the lands, the waters, the skies, and all of our relations, all spirits in life that have or that make up the lands that we draw our identity from. So, with that being who we are and kind of what we're here to talk about today, I'm very excited to kick off our panel, which will be a bit of a discussion amongst our panelists here about some of the work being done across the Métis Nation. And I'd like to really start on a conversation that I believe is very important to the realm of Indigenous climate action, Indigenous climate change. And my first question is for you, Leona. It's if you could describe to the audience how MNBC is mobilizing to approach climate change and food security with its citizens.
Yeah, for sure. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I'm really grateful to be sharing this space with everyone today. I'm very excited to be able to talk about some of the work we're doing at Métis Nation BC, and I'll call that MNBC at times. That's what I'm referring to when it comes to food security. For those who may not be too familiar with Canada, British Columbia, or BC, is the westernmost province. It's very, very big, very diverse, and very beautiful. We have coastal marine ecosystems, mountains, glaciers, boreal forests, and so much more. And it has very rich biodiversity as well. A lot of these species are harvested and used for foods and medicine by Métis and other Indigenous people in British Columbia. This includes species like the iconic Pacific salmon, moose, and fiddleheads. A little bit just about MNBC before I jump into the food work. We represent 25,000 registered citizens, and these citizens can be found within 40 different Métis charter communities throughout the province. The province is divided into 7 different regions, and these communities are just as rich and diverse as the province. Some are rural, some are remote, but most are urban. Through climate change, the rise in emergencies have brought forward the need to understand global impacts that were previously unforeseen. Food affordability, availability, and accessibility to nutritious and nutritional foods have been important topics in British Columbia and across the entirety of Canada, especially as it relates to Indigenous peoples, so Métis, First Nations, and Inuit people. This is the same across the entire globe. The past few years, in British Columbia, we've been experiencing increasingly severe weather events, which includes wildfires, floods, drought, and heat domes. All of these impacting our access to food and to land. Historically, Métis governance and culture were influenced by harvesting activities like buffalo hunts and fur trading. This has cultural significance for Métis, and historically this was led by captains of the hunt. These captains can be found across the entire homeland, but in British Columbia we call them the British Columbia Métis Assembly of Natural Resources, or BC Manor. They are well-respected knowledge holders based on the culturally relevant laws of the buffalo hunt. Historically, the captains set up hunts composed of families and community members, and they worked together to provide and produce what they needed to survive from local environments. Food sources, such as the making of pemmican, drove a lot of these harvesting activities. And lives were intricately connected with food and experiences of Métis, and this is important to understanding the effects of climate change and food access. It has become increasingly important to know how to access food is affecting community members in British Columbia, and at the moment there's very little data available. So in 2022, we administered at MNBC a survey titled Climate Change and Food Access Survey. And one of the goals of this survey was to gain insight into how to access nutritious and nutritional foods when it relates to the current climate and health emergencies. The survey was open for 2 weeks, and we had about 300 respondents, which was great. But most of this was women, about 70%, and most of this was from urban areas, which does make sense because in British Columbia, most Métis population is found in the urban areas. But in the future, we want to increase the gender diversity for our next research. Within this survey, we asked about some socioeconomic factors impacting food access, like housing, economic status, numbers of people per household. But in this talk today, I'm going to focus more on traditional subsistence and then like the harvesting, gathering, trapping. Historically, due to colonial assimilative policies and practices, Métis were discouraged from practicing or passing down traditional knowledge to children and grandchildren. This included knowledge about food, traditional harvesting, and protocols. Métis relied on themselves and others to provide basic needs, including food, shelter, and clothing. These values of independence, self-reliance, and resourcefulness are carried to present-day behaviors. Many youth today are attempting to reclaim and relearn these traditional ways of knowing, and this includes connecting with traditional foods and ways of harvesting. I'm going to just summarize the results at a high level. And in our survey for respondents, traditional subsistence practices, including hunting, trapping, fishing, and gathering, we asked how important these activities were to community members, and all of them, most of them I should say, not all, almost all, said very important or extremely important. Unfortunately though, about half the respondents did not participate in hunting, trapping, or gathering of wild plants. But on a positive note, more than half the participants in the household either fished or planted gardens. This data reveals some of the intricacies of participating in Métis subsistence behaviors, and it speaks to the experiences of maybe more urban Métis who did answer the survey, and they don't have as much access to the land or places where wild plants and animals thrive. Generally, activities like fishing and planting gardens are more easily accessible to activities for Métis and BC to access. We were curious maybe what was preventing them from accessing traditional foods. And the top reasons actually included a lack of knowledge about the traditional foods, a lack of knowledge of where to harvest, and a lack of knowledge around the protocols to harvest in a good way. Cost of gas and one's relationship with land stewards, so the First Nations, were also indicated as barriers. The reliance on personal or community gardens is significant for Métis in British Columbia. Over 80% said they'd eaten vegetables and fruits or vegetables from personal or community gardens in the past year. At MNBC, we've been running a program called the Home Garden Project. It started as a pandemic project back in 2020, and it's continued. It was a pilot with 150 households. We're now doing up to 500, and we're adding in some skill building workshops as well, and it's been really successful. The cost and availability of food, as well as the way Métis practice subsistence behaviors, are impacted by climate change. For almost all respondents, climate change is extremely important to very important. In most cases, community members have reported they've seen impacts of climate change on their environment, and this includes their harvesting grounds and in their own backyard gardens. In fact, 90% stated they've seen the impact on climate change on environment, weather, food systems, and or the land base. They notice there's increases in extreme weather events, increasing temperatures, unpredictable weather, and these all impact subsistence practice and more major impacts to food systems in British Columbia. And some people even talked about how increasing urbanization affects food supply and government policies, restricts subsistence practice, and they limit harvesting. Due to the now ever-changing, unpredictable nature of our climate, more sustainable food practice such as canning and preserving food become even more important. Canning and the preservation of food are helpful when preparing for natural disasters, pandemics, and food emergencies. Many community members shared they practice preserving and canning food, but this is also impacted by food and supply costs and a lack of knowledge. As food insecurity, climate change, and various emergencies persist, government and community leaders must listen to the lived experience of Métis to combat these issues. By meeting their concerns with holistic programs and policies, Métis will be able to live in healthier lives with a sense of security that they can rely on local food systems for individual and community needs. In turn, these programs will help community members be better prepared for emergencies, both on a food and climate-related emergencies. I'd like to end with just a quote from a community member in British Columbia. And I think it's an important reminder that as community members lose access to the land and to traditional foods due to shifting climates, we lose a lot more than just food. So here's the quote. I think food is an important connection in all cultures, including Métis. It brings people together in community. It brings us out on the land. It makes us feel gratitude. It's extremely important to our identity as Métis people. The lack of connection to the land and our food attributes to health problems, including physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leona. I think One thing that Leona has touched on here with the Métis Nation of British Columbia that really resonates with our history as Métis people is the Captains of the Hunt. The Captains of the Hunt historically was the first kind of system of governance our people ever had. And that systems of governance was built upon, say, sustainability. It was how we ensured that the buffalo, the animal, the sustenance and the life that sustained our communities would be there for future generations as well as those who have them to feed their immediate needs. So I'd really like to applaud MNBC for what they're doing to continue that legacy of sustainability, continue that legacy of the the Captains of the Hunt. So with that said, thank you very much, Leona. I'd like to shift the conversation just over the Rocky Mountains now to Alberta, to yourself, Jen. As a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta myself, I've been the benefactor and had the pleasure of taking part in many of the wonderful programs that you're putting on in Alberta. And I'm just very curious if you could share with the audience of how at MNA you've turned engagement with citizens into action.
Thank you, Dane. Thanks, Leona. I think the first thing to understand about climate action in a Métis context is that you really have to understand who the Métis are and what their relationship with the land and the skies and the waters is like. And thanks for providing some context and history of the Métis. As Dane said, we're a people from the merging of two cultures, First Nations and settler. We walk in two worlds. We have a strong relationship to the lands that we were born from. And I really want to emphasize the word relationship very on purpose. And I want everyone to take a second and think about the relationships in your life, the good relationships in your life, and what makes them good. What qualities makes a good relationship? I think of care, I think of trust, love, respect, reciprocity. And then think about bad relationships. I wish we never had to go through those, but we all have maybe had a bad relationship in our life, a bad friendship, and what qualities existed in those spaces. I think of worry, doubt, anger, an uneven relationship, something extractive. Métis people and Indigenous people have values and teachings that reinforce good relationships with the land, the air, the water. In every interaction we have with the lands where we receive something, we give thanks and we give back. Sadly, that is not the way that humans as a whole, on a global scale, have really been having a relationship with the earth. Capitalism and colonialism, patriarchy, systems created by humans have caused our relationship to the earth to become extractive. And we take, but we don't care or love or give back. And if we want to make real progress in this space and take real climate action, we first need to redefine how we view our relationship with the planet. We cannot continue to take what we want if we want to heal our relationship. If we want to do adaptation and if we want to do mitigation in a good way, we need to lead with the idea that our relationship between Mother Earth and our environment, our climate, has to be reciprocal. So what does all of that have to do with community engagement and climate action? That relationship, the idea of a good relationship, is really the foundation of everything that I do in my work and we do in our work. Every program we build, every initiative we begin, that it all comes from a relationship that we build from us and our citizens and their connection and our connection to the land. When we go to our citizens and we speak with them, we listen and we give them space to tell us what they feel. We listen to their worries and their priorities, their needs, their motivations. Then after we've spent a good time with them to listen to them, we take that back and we build that into an initiative or program that serves the things that they need. It's something for them that came from them. The thing is that listening to Métis people and listening to Indigenous people and prioritizing their needs and their solutions, the ones that come from an understanding that, reciprocity with the land is inherent to what we believe, that is climate action in all of these spaces. So what have I done with the things that I've learned from my community? we went out and we spent time with people. We talked to them. What did they want? We, did the classic thing. We built an action plan. And we built all of our pillars. But the real meat of it was that we delivered on actual solutions. They told us that they wanted us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So we secured land and built a solar farm. We have a 4.86 megawatt solar farm that's opening up, and it's going to offset all the electricity from all of our organization and all of our housing corporation that our Métis citizens live in. And what we did with that is we also built into that the profits we receive from that solar farm goes into a community action fund, and it gives back to the community. So it's not just for us and our citizens, it goes to the community where that solar farm is, and it builds that capacity for them. We heard that our citizens were concerned about the species that they harvest and the fish that they are, wanting to eat and get for their family. So we have monitoring programs where they tell us about their fish, they tell us about their lakes, they tell us what they see. They're worried about migratory birds, so they tell us about that, and we monitor that, and we take that when we speak to our province and we speak to our country, and we elevate their voices in those spaces. And we heard that they were worried about, their lands being mismanaged and managed in a really colonial extractive way. So we've been working to take the land back and have it, managed in a way that Métis steward the land and traditional practices of land management. And then they can come to that space and they can connect to their land and they can feel pride in the way that it's managed. So I hope these projects are just a way, that serve for examples of how Métis people, Indigenous people, because of their inherent connection and their strong relationship with the land, they have to be a part of the conversation when it comes to climate mitigation and adaptation. Without the inclusion of these voices, the voices that carry knowledge of how to have a good relationship with the earth, real strong and meaningful climate action will never fully occur. Thank you.
So, Jen, I think a lot of times we come into these spaces and we talk about the programming and the projects that we're doing, but they don't always have to be something technical. And I think one thing that I've really enjoyed seeing coming out of the Métis Nation of Alberta is how you're mobilizing the community with things like the ice fishing derby, where the M&A will get family, community out on the ice, fishing and bringing in fish, measuring them, taking samples, and getting kind of that idea of the quality of the fish and what's happening with the water there. I think that's something that's very inherently Métis, is bringing community around the table and, not just looking to Western institutions like universities, research centers to give us their information on what constitutes science, but rather putting ourselves into that frame of science. And I'm sure, as you know as much as I do, as somebody who has a Western education, that braiding knowledge is a term that really gets used in these spaces of how do we braid knowledge of Indigenous knowledge and science. I'm wondering, how can you speak to how you've seen that play out at M&A, and how are you braiding knowledge in community action?
Yeah, we whenever we kind of conduct a program or create an initiative, like I said, it's from the community, it's by the community for them. And I'll give an example. We have this fish monitoring program where, we do all the Western science methods. We measure the fish, we take the sample, we send it to the lab, and they tell us good or bad. And we realized we were missing a huge understanding of what was actually going on in that environment and in those lakes. And so we went out and did a bunch of interviews with harvesters and with fishermen and asked them just about their experience fishing over their lives, what they'd noticed in the changes of the lakes that they'd spent time in. And things that I noticed when speaking with them was that they would always reference back the biologists. They would always reference back the scientists. And they'd say, I think they're smaller, but that's not what the biologists say. And it's because these systems have told them that their knowledge is not of the same value of those scientists. If you have that piece of paper, very expensive, many of us have one, that's the most valuable type of knowledge that exists. But that's not true. And that's not the way it actually is in the real world. So it's, speaking with them and making their voices, elevating their voices and bringing those into our program. And we took all the things we learned and developed with them a way that what does looking at fish health actually, how do you look at a healthy fish or an unhealthy fish? What does it look like? You know, they told us slimy and grimy, and that's valuable. That counts. That is a scientific piece. If they say slimy is bad, it's the same as, you know, pH 4.9. It's just as valuable to have that knowledge. If they say it looked slightly different in color, it tasted differently. You know, we never talk about taste when we talk about science necessarily. Those are indicators that Métis people and Indigenous people have from passed down from lived experience. And we really need to value that lived experience at the same level that we value learning from being in a classroom. So we're really trying to build all of that in, and then, you know, bringing that here and sharing that and trying to get that message out, that that is a huge gap in science is missing, is that experiential lived knowledge that Indigenous people have. So really trying to pull that back.
Thank you so much, Jen. And I think this is kind of a common theme that you'll hear at the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion, whether it's ourselves representing the Métis from what is now Canada, or if you're hearing from folks in Central Africa or in places like Indonesia, is that we're experiencing climate change in a way that no one else is. And when you come to this space and you have to listen to a negotiator from Brussels who's never been more than 20 kilometers from a city, it's really hard to have this conversation because those folks, they don't experience climate change like we do. They don't experience climate change on their kitchen table. They don't, well, not yet at least. They don't experience climate change when they're just trying to communicate with their spirituality, with their friends, with their families, or even their mobility. There's no ice roads in Europe that I'm aware of, at least. Sorry if any of my Sami or Inuit folks are in the room and I've misspoken, but to my knowledge, those aren't realities that the people who have the power here have to experience. They're part of our culture. And with that said, I'd like to move to our next panelist. This is Cole Cretchen. Everybody, give Cole Cretchen a bit of a hand here, because this is his first time leaving Canada.
Thank you so much.
And he's sitting up on stage here. So Cole, you've since the very first time I met you, you didn't take more than a second to hop right into talking about culture. And I was blown away by how much knowledge and immersion that you have in our culture, especially given how you're a young man. So I know you've been bringing that to the work you're doing at M&S, and I'd really appreciate if you could share with the audience, how is M&S building climate action on a foundation of our culture?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you for saying that as well, because this is not something I consciously grew up with. I think you look back on your life and you go, oh, that's why I know how to do that. That's where that came from, right? Like, that's why I fish, and I moved to predominantly white community in Saskatchewan. Nobody fishes. There's no water around, right? Like, and then I meet other people. They don't fish in the same way, not with the same ethic behind it, the same respect for the waters and the fish themselves, right? So it's something that like I've kind of grown to know about. And at Métis Nation Saskatchewan, my director always says there's no point in doing any of this unless it has a cultural basis, because anyone can deliver environmental programming. The Canadian government could do it for us. The Saskatchewan government could do it for us. If we're going to deliver it to our citizens, it has to have a basis in Métis culture. It has to be unique that way. So I guess the best way for me to start this would be to talk a little bit about Métis culture. And I think Jen touched on a lot of this. And when you're confronted with it, when you go to a room full of Métis people in community and you do engagement or you speak to them about the issues, it becomes very apparent, I guess, a lot of what the cultural uniqueness of the Métis community is. But I would describe it as there's really two different concepts that I think come from Michif. They both come from Michif. And the first is Wakotawin, right? And Wakotawin is interconnection between all things. I think when you were speaking before about relationships, this is all my relations, is what it means. So it comes from the Cree, the Métis use it as well. And it's about not just your familial relations, not just people, but We are related to the land, the skies, the waters and rivers, the animals, and I think it's not something that even came naturally to me to think like that. It was one of those things where I said, okay, I can commit to that, but I'm going to pretend like that's real. I'm going to pretend like that's real until I believe it's real, right? And I think it's something where the longer you sort of live with it and you think about it, yes, we are related to everything. We're related through use and extraction, and these are bad relations, as Jen had told us, right? So Wokotowin becomes about making sure that we are good stewards of the land, we are good stewards of our animal herds, our animal populations, and that we are reestablishing good relations, and that we're bringing that to the work we do. So that's one aspect of it. The other thing I think that's really important to talk about, okay, I'm going to try and say this. Ka Tepe Mishoyak. I don't use this one as often, but this means self-governance, essentially, right? So I really associate this with, while Métis people are rooted in land, we are rooted in place. I feel very strongly about my home. We're also nomadic. Historically, we went where we felt like the lands were not enclosed. We were free to roam where we could find resources. So if there were plants over a hill over there, we'd go over there. If the buffalo were, 100 kilometers to the south, we go follow the buffalo, right? I think there's a self-direction that sort of kicks in. And Dane spoke about the buffalo hunt before, right? And I think where these concepts really come into play is in that buffalo hunt governance structure, where you can look at, once the buffalo hunt is happening, they would summon everybody to one place and they would elect leaders. And the governance structure was not top down. It was not in the same colonial way where we would say, okay, well, we're all living under a government all the time, and there's rules that you have to follow by even when you go home and no one's watching you. The government would just arise when there was a task to be done, right? So we think about that in the context of the buffalo hunt. Okay, we're all hunting buffalo, so we're going to elect captains. We're going to create rules. There are, in fact, what we call laws of the buffalo hunt. They're written down, and debatably, they are Canada's first conservation law, because they were made not to keep people, well, mostly, to keep people from taking more than their fair share, right? From going out ahead in front of the other captains, taking their squads, and overkilling, I guess, right? Like over-harvesting, taking too much from the environment, right? So, okay, where am I going with this? I guess with the buffalo hunt, the point is, governance structure arises naturally, right? It comes from the land itself. It comes from our relation to the animals and our commitments to them as brothers and sisters in that network of Wokotowin, right? So when we see ourselves, I guess, the most successful in our department is when we are immediately responsive in that way, right? When we can think of ourselves as the government just arises, wherever the problem is. If people are experiencing food insecurity and I go into community and I hear that, right? First thing I want to do is go back and figure out how we're going to find the money to create a food security program. And, that is something that had happened recently. As I went into community and people spoke to me very passionately about lack of access to good, wholesome foods, both vegetables, but also our traditional foods, our moose and our deer, right? And it's urban people, it's rural people, it's everyone in between. The cost of food is going up. Climate change is affecting our plants and our animals, and how the populations are. What's the word? Where the herds are going, where they're grazing, right? Their movement patterns, and so what we did, I guess, is we took that away, and we're looking to launch a food security program that's going to have culture camps that teach people how to hunt and skin animals, right? We're also going to have gardening kits for people to help them, field trips to the grocery store, start developing their own food sources in their own backyard, right? And also potentially looking at a food security sustainability series. So we'd be doing a web seminar just about, hey, if you have a food processor, here's how you can do this in your kitchen, right? But also, here's how you can make traditional Métis food. Like, I don't think people realize bannock, which is something a lot of Canadian Indigenous people share. It's like 2 ingredients. Like, you can you can have a meal with like 2 or 3 ingredients, you know? So making sure that we are showing people that like the key to sustainability, the key to fighting climate change, it's within us. We used to know how to live like this, and now we don't, right? Like, we're kind of we're fat off the hog, right? We're all like living in capitalism, and everybody is I don't know, they're dependent on it in a way that they wouldn't previously be. We're becoming increasingly urbanized and rediscovering that old way and bringing it to not just the urban people, but the young people who might not know, and they might not have anybody to teach them, right? So I guess it was a journey. I hope that made sense. But that's what it means to be culturally rooted.
So I'd like to thank you very much for bringing our language into the space, and just within the audience, you know, we're at COP. How many languages are being spoken here? And I'm going to go out on a limb and assume everybody in this audience at least speaks a little bit of another language. And when you do learn another language, you learn another way of thinking. Like, my second language is unfortunately not our traditional language. It's German, but when I speak German, I have to think differently, and I have to go about it differently. And that word you brought today, there's certain words that exist in other languages that don't exist in English. And I think Wet'suwet'en is one of those words that needs to exist in English. Because when we talk about Wet'suwet'en and how Wet'suwet'en applies to what's important to us, it's not a hierarchical approach to the world. It's seeing yourself amongst everything, all your relations, from every pebble to every mountain, to every blade of grass, to every tree. You see yourself amongst everything. And when we think about something that's been talked about a lot here, a food source that's extremely important to us, the buffalo. In order to have the buffalo, if you were to say from a Western perspective, well, that is a keystone species in which that you need blah, 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 blah amount of caloric intake, and it's a hierarchical approach to how you get the buffalo to exist. In our culture, it's Wet'suwet'en. It's how do you exist in relation to that buffalo and everything that sustains that buffalo as it sustains you. So that being the case, Cole, there's some very exciting news coming out of Saskatchewan right now. Could you share with the audience what's happening at Batoche and who's coming back to Batoche?
So first, I'm going to explain what Batoche is really quickly. Batoche is a historic Métis community in Saskatchewan. It's the site of the second major, so what I'm looking for, resistance against the Canadian government. So the first is in Red River in Manitoba. Then the Métis move out of there because they become surrounded. The deal's broken, kind of, and they become surrounded by settlers. The land that they were promised, or they thought they were going to be promised, was not necessarily upheld. So they come to Saskatchewan, the community of Batoche, and it's a major trading outpost. It's also pretty much the next thing to being closed, right? Like, it's just, they're moving everything westward, right? So Saskatchewan is in the process. They're surveying land. The Canadian government is looking to dispossess the Métis once again. And they stage what we were taught in schools in Canada, a rebellion. Now I call it the Northwest Resistance. I think that's a little bit more tasteful. I think it shows things better from the Métis perspective. But Batoche was returned, I believe, last year to the Métis Nation by Parks Canada. So we got everything that is currently being used for tourism. That's co-development. We can do what we want with that. Alongside the Parks Canada, but they have their piece as well, right? Everything west of the river, I think it's 690 hectares. That's ours now. So that is land that we can develop as we see fit. So there's a lot of things going on out there, but just yesterday they brought a bunch of buffalo. The buffalo are coming back, right? So the buffalo are coming back to the prairies. And I was not here for this, but it's massively important to Métis people, I think, to have those there. So they're going to be housed in a paddock for the first bit, but eventually they will be running free on that 690 hectares on the other side of the river. So, it's So I don't know. I guess like what that means to Métis people, symbolically, but also in practical terms, like that is us seeing our lands returned to us and partially restored to how our ancestors would have experienced them, right? Which is like a little game I like to play in my head where I like knock over all the buildings and I try and imagine like, you know, what it would look like if it was just clear natural pasture and how my ancestors would have experienced that, right? And like Batoche, we're working on it. We want to make sure that that is a place that looks undisturbed, that has, you know, natural ecological beauty to it, because in Saskatchewan you don't think of it as, you know, having rainforest or mountains or oceans or anything really cool like that. But once we had prairies, and it's a biome and an ecosystem that's very, very endangered. So buffalo coming back is sort of like the first piece in returning to that.
Thank you very kindly, Cole. And I think, you know, you bring up something important there is, you know, you'll walk around this space and you'll see signs that say land back. It's not just land back. It's water back, fish back, buffalo back, the birds, the trees back. It's Indigenous land management back. It's doing things in a sustainable way based upon stewardship, based upon culture, based on community. That's what's meant by land back. So thank you very much, Cole, for giving those wonderful updates about Batoche. It's absolutely thrilling to know that our culture, our relations are coming back to us, coming back to our community. So with that said, though, moving to Ontario, we've talked about you know, a lot of what's happening in the prairies and in the mountains. But moving to Ontario, Jordan, if you could please kind of share with the audience a bit of an overview of the work being done by the Métis Nation of Ontario when it comes to climate action.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to recognize my fellow panelists. What I'm hearing from you folks is something similar that's happening in Ontario is we don't do this top-down approach. What I'm hearing collectively is we listen to the people and then we take that direction up. And I think I'm in a unique situation here where I don't work within the Métis Nation of Ontario. I'm actually an elected leader. And so my job every day is to sit with my community and to sit not just with young people, young Métis people across Ontario, but also to sit with my elders, with our community members, with our captains of the hunt in my home communities, and to listen and learn from them. But maybe I want to give a little bit of a background on what is the Métis Nation of Ontario. So unlike some of our other folks on this panel, we're actually the youngest governing member. We're 30 years old, but that doesn't mean Métis people are 30 years old in Ontario. We have a deep connection to the communities that we exist in. My family from like 1872 has existed in my home community. So although the Métis Nation of Ontario is quite young, we've been a vibrant community for much longer than the Métis Nation of Ontario has existed. But within the MNO, so the Métis Nation of Ontario, one of the branches that we have is our Lands, Resources and Consultations department, and that's really what spearheads a lot of the climate change and environment work that happens. And two programs I really wanted to highlight today are important because they're actually two of the programs that young people engage in the most within the Métis Nation of Ontario. And not only do they give young people the ability to acquire skills, we also have been able in some communities to provide them funding. It has allowed young people to have more increased job accessibility and also learning about some of the lands and waters in particular that surround our communities. So I've been really fortunate to grow up in my home community of Penetangwisheen, which is situated along the shores of Georgian Bay. And so this first project that happened actually was a super popular project in my community. I think we had to waitlist folks because it was so exciting. And so it was a community water monitoring project. So it gave young people hands-on experience in environmental monitoring and tools that a lot of the folks, it actually wasn't, when I talk about young people, I represent folks 16 to 29, but this particular project actually, the most young people that engaged in it were secondary students, so that they could then take a lot of those skills, and they're now in these post-secondary institutions getting the very expensive pieces of paper to hopefully come back into our communities and bring that knowledge, both that they learned in water monitoring as well as in these colonial institutions, back into our community. So in the summer of 2020, 2021 and 2022, M&O citizens across Ontario learned skills and tools to take onto the land. And in the summer of 2022, we actually launched our project, and we called them our Métis Guardians. So they sampled water bodies in the spring, summer, and into the fall. Actually, because of climate change, one of our staff was out just last week sampling some of the water because the lakes haven't frozen over quite yet. So they're looking for things like pH, dissolvable oxygens, conductivity, and temperatures. And then the programs included site-specific lab analysis and water samplings to test for a variety of different concerns. And so not only, like I said, was this project super valuable to citizens and our young people, it also allowed them to get those employable skills, and it allowed them to connect with the water in a way that maybe they haven't been able to. I think a lot about my journey as a Métis person and how my story of my family. There's always these dark periods in families in my community, and how maybe some young people have never had the opportunity to connect with the water and learn from their water and the land that they exist on. And so this project allowed folks to have that reconnection and really start to understand their Métis identity in a way that maybe they wouldn't have learned in a classroom or they would have learned in the home, but also with that land. I know someone talked about earlier about how, as Indigenous people, when we connect with the sand and the land and the water, that's how we can really start to understand ourselves. And that's what that project did. The second one was our Save the Bees program. So we know that climate change, pesticide use, and habit loss have contributed to insect and specifically bee populations declining in so-called Canada. And because of this, we heard that from our 2019 engagement from our citizens. And so our LRC branch, doing what I think the Métis Nation does best, is creates programs based on what our citizens want. So they created a local Métis household bee project, and it was specifically to train households in setting up bee hotels, encouraging them to report on the planning of bloom times and filling out surveys prior, during, and after, so that we could start to understand species and weather that affect some of the bee pollinations and bee populations. So the project itself was really exciting because it allowed families, community members, our community councils to apply to get these bee hotels. They would get planting supplies, they got books and resources to help them start to identify native bees and plants. And the project, honestly, it was such a great success. Again, another program that I think had a huge waiting list, which speaks volumes to the need and the desire to engage in some of these hand-based and hands-on learning opportunities. So we launched it this year in May, and it went between May and October. And at our assembly this year, it was so exciting. We always show slideshows, and all of the pictures that were actually submitted were of people out on the land with these bee hotels. People painted them in like really fun, exciting ways. And it was really an awesome opportunity to see folks from kind of some of our northwestern communities all the way down to maybe some of our Windsor, kind of more southern Ontario regions, really getting out and onto the land. And because of that, the Métis Nation of Ontario Youth Council, so the council that I sit on as the president, we saw this and we said, how can we engage young people in a way that maybe they want to go out and do this, whether it's in their home communities or maybe if they've moved away because of post-secondary or whatever. How can we train young people to be involved in this? And I think I'm going to speak a little bit later on to the relationship that the youth have within our public service sector of our lands, resources, and consultation branch. And so we actually were able this year in August to bring in one of our young Métis staff members from my home community at our youth leadership conference to train about 50 young people on the bee monitoring project and the Save the Bees campaign. And so now next spring, so spring 2024, which will actually be here before we know it. We should have about 50 Métis people starting to put up their bee hotels and starting to report in that information and that data so that we can start to have data and information that's specific to young people, because we know that young people view and interpret and understand things maybe a little bit differently than other generations. So it's important to have some of that information. So those are two big projects that have been happening within the M&O that are really how we've transformed them to ensure that young people are involved and have knowledge and can not only participate in them, but how can they take those tangible skills into their next season of life with them.
Thank you so much, Jordy, and thank you for all the work you're doing to not only bring your youth as a person, but youth into this space, to mentor youth, not only here, but back in your community, and really take this back to community. And I think a lot of the things that have been touched on so far on this panel and what you've just shared with us is that, when we talk about climate change, when we come here, it's so much so talked about as, it's 1.5 degrees, which means if we take this much carbon out of the air, we'll have this much of blah, 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 and then nothing will occur either which way. But when I think of what's being said here today, we're talking about the realities of this. We're talking about our ability to eat, our ability to travel, our ability to gather, our ability to pass on our culture, our identity to our youth, our children. We're talking about our ability to exist as Indigenous peoples. That's what climate change is for us, is we have to come to this space without a vote, without a seat at the table, and try to make space just to say we have the right to exist. And I'm very excited to have our next panelist today, Kate, because Kate has been an absolute lightning rod, a dynamo for her work in forwarding Métis rights, human rights in a number of different spaces, such as United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the expert mechanism. So Kate, can you speak to, the importance of bridging what is said, what is done here with those spaces like the Permanent Forum or the expert mechanism?
Yeah, hi everyone. Good afternoon. I know we're running out of time here, so I'll try to keep it short and sweet. Before I get going, I just want to acknowledge how huge this is for the Métis Nation. We brought 15 delegates to COP28 this year, Métis citizens and representatives, and Dane isn't just a pretty face in a good suit. He organized all of this, so big shout out to Dane and our team here for representing the Métis Nation so proudly in everything we're doing here. And I also just want to thank Cole for A, speaking our language, but B, bringing up these two critical terms to the Métis Nation. And actually, it's funny that you brought up these terms. I actually did my MA thesis on Wekotwin and Otipemisiwak, and Wekotwin to me is like the white people's version of everything happens for a reason. And because we don't have a direct translation of it, right? And Wekotwin is actually why we're all here today. And Wekotwin is the reason we're all sitting on this panel together. So thank you for grounding us in that. I'll talk a little bit about how I got into this space. I don't have a background in international relations. I have a history degree and a master's in Indigenous studies. When I was doing my master's degree, grounded in these midshift terms, I came across an internship opportunity at the Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations. And in this job posting, it said at the bottom, we strongly encourage Indigenous applicants to apply. And so I went out on a whim and I applied, and I got this job, and I was the first ever Indigenous intern at the Permanent Mission of Canada. And this is in January of 2022. So we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to be done, and we're not even close to being there. So when I got to sit in on all these negotiations. I was there from January of 2022 until May of 2022, and the two primary files that I followed during my time there were the Commission on the Status of Women and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And during the Commission on the Status of Women, I saw Indigenous rights being used as a bargaining tool. And this is 15 years after the United Nations General Assembly accepted UNDRIP and adopted UNDRIP, and it was used as a bargaining tool. And Indigenous peoples, I was probably one of the only ones in the room at that point, and so it just sparked an ongoing anger inside of me. And then to follow this up, the Permanent Forum happened about a month later, and the Permanent Forum is one of the only opportunities. It is the only opportunity for Indigenous representative institutions to take a seat at the table in the United Nations General Assembly Hall. And when on the very first day of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, security stopped Indigenous peoples at the door and would not let them into the hall. during the only one of the only forums we actually have on Indigenous rights, and I was there with our president Cassidy Caron, and just it enraged me. Like, how dare you stop Indigenous folks from taking the one seat they have in this United Nations space? And so that's why I'm here. That's why I'm continuing to do this work, because I feel like we just have so much further to come. And I mean, so I stepped into this role at the Métis National Council in January of 2023. It is a new role, international relations. It has not been done in the past, and so I'm extremely grateful for our panelists here and the work that's being done across the governing members to support this work and their ongoing engagement and everything. But a large part of what I've done in the past almost year now is just build up a strategy. And there's 5 main components to the strategy, but I think for time's sake, I'm just going to focus on the last one. The most important part of us being here is to increase cohesion across the Métis Nation homeland and be in service to both our Métis governments and citizens. So when we're here, we're not voices, we're not individuals, we're here representing our citizens. And how many do we have? 160,000, 180,000 across the Métis homeland, and only 5 of us can be here right now, right? So that's a huge weight on each of our shoulders, but it's also it's a responsibility, but also a huge privilege. So really grateful to be able to walk in these spaces alongside my colleagues here. And to link this back to kind of the rights space, for folks who perhaps aren't so familiar, the United Nations has 3 mechanisms for the rights of Indigenous peoples, or 3 spaces, whatever you want to call them. There's the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples in Geneva at the Human Rights Council. There's the United Nations Permanent Forum on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, and then there's the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So we have these 3 bodies that kind of guide our work and our priorities across all these different spaces. And so when we come into this COP space, it's a technical, policy specific, thematic dialogue that goes on. But the folks that are here at this table, in this room, at the caucus, are the folks that are having these conversations in all these other spaces. Like, this is a full-time job, and I don't think that a lot of folks realize how much work goes into this. Like, I saw Hindu a little bit earlier, but she also sits on the Permanent Forum board, and so these folks are actively having these same conversations in every single one of these bodies, and that's exhausting. And it's a ton of work, and honestly, we're not being listened to in any of these spaces. But to tie this all back together, sorry, I have so many notes, and I know we're short on time here. I'll make the one last link to the Permanent Forum. This year's theme was actually Indigenous Peoples, Human Health, Planetary and Territorial Health, and Climate Change, a rights-based approach. And the final report on the Permanent Forum actually listed a number of recommendations to both the UNFCCC and the CBD COPs. So it just goes to show how closely intertwined all these bodies are. And the same reason that the Métis Nation sent a delegation to the Permanent Forum this year is the same reason all these folks are sitting in front of you today, is because the Métis Nation has an intimate connection with the homeland, and the well-being of our citizens is directly tied to the health of these territories. And ultimately, I'll just conclude with, so where are we? 2023. It's 16 years since UNDRIP has been adopted. Canada just came out with their UNDA implementation plan this year. So I'm optimistic to see where we can take this, but I'm also heavily discouraged all the time in these spaces, and it's a really fine balance. And that's why, again, I said thank you to Cole for grounding us in these concepts of Wokotwin and Otipemisiwak. And ultimately, like, I'll say one last thing. We're here because it's our right to be here. And it has been for 16 years, and that 16 years doesn't even take into account do quick math here, the 84 years. So to give a brief history here, it was in 1923 that the Haudenosaunee actually went to the League of Nations in Geneva to advocate for themselves as an Indigenous sovereign nation, and the League of Nations refused to hear their petition. So we're 100 years in the making, and I really liked what the Australian ambassador had to say the other day. So his position, he's the inaugural Aboriginal ambassador for Australia, but he's not the first ambassador that Australia has had. We've been taking up these positions in these spaces for generations and decades, and just since time immemorial. And again, like, we'll continue to do so because it's our inherent right to be here.
Thank you very much, Kate. Yeah. Please. So, in closing, I'd just like to state that it's our right to be here, and our solutions, our voices, our eyes, our ears, our knowledge has a right to be here. And we carry that. Every person on this panel carries that. And it's not an easy thing to carry. It's a heavy burden with many barriers. And if we can make it here with these solutions and these truths, imagine if we had the voice, the power of a nation like Luxembourg, a nation like Germany, a nation like Canada. So we come here today not only to say that we have a right to be here, but we're mobilizing. We're out there making it happen. And if you're looking for solutions, it has always been in the nature of our people, our nation, to honor our relationships to all our kin, all our relations, and share what we have, whether it be knowledge, solutions, friendship, our kitchen tables. That is what being Métis is. I'd like to thank you all for being here today, to offer your solutions, your voices, your minds, your ears, your eyes. I'd like to thank you for being at COP, for trying to be a part of this solution. Thank you very much. Safe travels to you. And that's it. Good hustle, guys. Yep.